Some call me Steve, Dad, husband, or friend. Others might call me boss, coach, or mentor. Today you can call me the Leadership Hacker. Thanks for listening in, I really appreciate it. My job as the Leadership Hacker is to hack into the minds, experiences, habits and learning of great leaders, C-suite executives, authors and development experts so that I can assist you developing your understanding and awareness of leadership. I'm Steve Rush and I'm your host today. I'm the author of Leadership Cake, I'm a transformation consultant and leadership coach and can't wait to start sharing all things leadership with you. Joining me on today's show is CEO and founder of Friday Pulse, statistician, happiness expert and TED speaker. It's Nic Marks. Before we get to speak with Nic, it's a Leadership Hacker News. In our role as leaders, we have likely to have made some significant decisions of late. Our approach to making decisions will vary from individual to individual, and whilst some considered and thoughtful strategic decisions would have absolutely been a must at work, recent research has found using a coin toss to decide major life decisions may ultimately make you happier. The new study has found overall happiness increased after a 6-month period. The study, titled The Review of Economic Studies, published in the Oxford University Press, also found that people who rely on a coin toss to make a decision are more likely to follow through with their choice and be more satisfied as a result. To find out the impact of using a coin toss, economist Professor Stephen Levitt from the University of Chicago asked people to make important decisions such as whether to quit a job, move home, end a relationship or quit smoking using affirmative and negative assigned to either heads or tails of a coin. Users were also asked to include their own questions such as, should I get a tattoo? And prior to the coin toss, volunteers were also instructed to help identify a third-party adjudicator to verify their outcomes and assess independently the results. After 2 months, participants and their third-party adjudicators were asked to conduct a survey, which found that participants favoured the status quo, making a change less frequently than they'd predicted that they would before the coin toss, according to phys.org. However, a further study conducted after 6 months found that this bias towards the status quo had gone. According to the 6-month survey, those who were interested to make certain changes regarding major decisions were more likely to do so and be happier as a result. Participants also said that they were more likely to make the same decision if they were to choose again. According to the researchers, the findings were inconsistent with the conventional theory of choice, which states that people who are on the margin should, on average, report equal happiness regardless of where they made the decisions. Professor Levitt said, society teaches us that quitters never win and winners never quit, but in reality the data from his experiment suggests we would all be better off if we did more quitting. He went on to say, a good rule of thumb in decision making is, whenever you cannot decide what you should do, choose the action that represents a change rather than continue with the status quo. The leadership lesson here is we often get stuck in change and we're not sure on which direction to take. And whilst tossing a coin might give us a yes or a no to a certain direction, does that change really bring about something new? So that's been the Leadership Hacker News. We'd really encourage you to share with us your insights, ideas and funny stories around leadership and leaders around the world. So please get in touch. I'm joined on today's show with Nic Marks. He's the CEO and creator of Friday Pulse. He's an author, TED speaker, and a statistician. Nic, welcome to the Leadership Hacker podcast.
Thank you very much, Steve.
So, statistician, numbers, I guess that must have started at an early age for it to become such a big feature in your life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of syllables in that word as well, isn't there? Statistician. I was good at maths and wasn't very interested in much else at school. I mean, I did my A levels were double maths physics, and half of physics is maths as well. So it was what sort of I could do, and therefore, I was top of the year at school, pretty much all the way through, and pretty much ended up at Cambridge reading maths before I'd made a decision about anything, and actually ended up not liking maths at Cambridge because it's very, very pure, and therefore discovering I was really an applied statistician. That I liked using numbers to solve problems rather than the sort of abstractness of mathematics, which is what you get into in that space. So yeah, it's kind of what I was good at.
So the fascination really was not just about the patterns and the numbers, but actually how can you use these numbers in a positive way, and how can I apply them to doing something that's relevant for people?
Yeah, that was the big eye-opener when I started sort of solving things, particularly on health statistics. They'd start setting you problems to solve maybe an A level, and anything that sort of had a bit more human side to it. I enjoyed those questions more. And that's what I was actually able to do at Cambridge, was I was able to switch into an applied statistics course. And, we did sort of industrial psychology and queuing theory. Queues, even now, if I get in a queue and I can see it's badly organized, that puts me in a rage. And it's partly my queuing theory sort of ideas. But so anything that was very practical, I got interested in.
And even more so during lockdown, where there are queues everywhere, I should imagine for you particularly, that's really challenging, right?
Well, actually, what I don't like about queues is when they're not fair. I don't mind a fair queue. And actually, the lockdown queues are very fair, aren't they? You're standing there in order, and you let older people pass if you're a certain time, or key workers, and that all seems very fair. What I really hate is like when you come into an airport and you're queuing up, and there's a big queue at the the passport control, and they haven't put enough people on, but then you can't see if the front of your queue's got 1 or 2 people on it. And so the queues go at different rates, and you always end up in the slowest queue. In fact, you're statistically more likely to end up in the slower queue anyway. But then it feels unfair. And I once actually had an argument with a passport control guy, not an argument, a discussion. And I said to him, why don't you queue up in a snake? And he said, actually, it makes the average queuing time go up, which is a very fair thing. And I said to him, well, the problem is the experience of queuing is related to the standard deviation, not the mean. And he looked at me and went,
I should imagine that went down well.
Yeah, can you put that in writing, please, sir? My kids were very embarrassed.
And who would have known that queues have so much applied maths behind it? Which I guess if you look around society that we're in, there are maths and numbers behind everything.
I mean, totally. I mean, if you do marketing these days, digital marketing, you've got a lot of queuing theory and mathematics in there, and about friction and flow and the way you model it. So there's so many ways that at least a sort of good A-level understanding of maths can really, really help you. I don't think you need to go much beyond that, but obviously some people do. But it is very interesting to me, anyway.
So beyond university, then you started applying your learned mathematics. What happened next?
So I did a master's, and then I joined a consultancy. I mean, Anderson Consulting, who's sort of now called Accenture, and did programming and things like that. But I quit really when I realized they were just going to sort of move me around the country to wherever they wanted me to work, and I just got engaged and was in London and didn't really want to move around. And I also started to make more choices in my life. I mean, I think some people this comes earlier, but I started thinking, actually, what do I really want to work on? And I went to work for a sustainability environmental investment company, and I started getting more interested in things which are sort of, as I say, sort of more socially useful statistics. Yeah, and I did that for a bit, but I also had a slightly, not kooky side, but slightly different side. As I got very into sort of personal development, and I used to go to sort of men's encounter groups because I didn't really quite understand how to be a man in a world I found slightly misogynist. And so I started exploring all that. And the reason for that really was my mum was a therapist. And in the end, I trained as a therapist as well as doing my statistics, which sort of makes for, I think, a very creative mix, but an unusual mix anyway.
So that creative mix you now have has smudged that psychotherapy and your statistician background together to create what you do now. The last 12, 15 years of your life, you've been really focusing on the whole principle of happiness and how we can be more focused and understand some of the metrics and numbers that sit behind happiness. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, it started in about 2001. I was doing some other work with a think tank in London called New Economics Foundation, and the then director, said to me, Nick, there's this word called well-being coming into public policy, and no one knows what it means. And can you help us, he said, drive some meaning under the word? And I, being a statistician, I said, well, I'd like to know how we could measure it, because then, policymakers might take it seriously. So we started a project which eventually became my whole work, which was and it became something called the Centre for Wellbeing. But we started to create metrics around wellbeing that was useful for local, national, and international agencies about people's experience of life effectively. And some people in the field were already calling that happiness, and I shied away from that for a while because it sounded a bit light for government policy. But I started to realize that it was a much more attractive word than well-being, and also more relatable. And ultimately, whether we enjoy our lives or not, in whatever basis we want to do that, is kind of what it's about. So it's sort of and you can talk to anyone about whether they're happy or not. We can then discuss what that means, and we can discuss, whether we mean the same thing. But it makes a much more fruitful discussion. So that's kind of how I got into it. Yeah,
it's a really neat principle. The whole happiness thing that I've explored, and there are a number of great authors have written around a similar subject over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. It almost feels a little bit pink and fluffy and subjective. And I guess what you're seeking to do is to create some more objectivity so that leaders can be a bit more thoughtful of their personal impact around that. Would that be a kind of fair assumption?
It is kind of fair, but I don't like, it's not you, but I don't like this sort of split between objective and subjective, because our experience of life is sort of necessarily subjective. We are the subject of that experience. And actually, what a lot of statistics and data does is it objectifies things. So it will say we can measure your standard of life because we can see that and touch that. So we can touch your housing, your income, your whatever. We can measure that, but we don't know what you're feeling, so we can't measure that. And actually, that's not true. It's just a different type of measurement, and you have to be careful about how you do it. But you can put numbers on it, and so there's a way we use the word subjective, which makes it feel like it's very loose and it would change to everybody. But actually, whether people enjoy their lives or not is sort of gradable.
Yeah, okay. That makes loads of sense, actually. If somebody was to ask you, what does happiness mean? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I've had various descriptions over the years, but so I often say it's feeling good and doing well. And by that, I mean that it's got a feeling element, but it's got a functional element to it. And we use the word happiness very broadly in the English language. So we use it as a sort of momentary feeling. I feel happy. But we also use it as what tends to be called a cognitive assessment. I feel happy with, or I'm happy with. So we're sort of reflecting on a sort of judgment about something. And then there's a school of thought that thinks that happiness is a sort of capability, that it's that knowing or feeling that I can deal with anything is a feeling of happiness. So it's sort of like a perceived resilience going forward. I can cope with things. So in that sense, I think there is a functional element to it, and actually purely from a psychological perspective or neuroscience perspective, then feelings and emotions actually help us act in the world. So there is this sort of, they're not just there as sort of a nice sensation, they actually motivate us to behave in certain ways. So that's how I tend to think of it, as feeling good and doing well. But then there's another nuance which I quite like, which goes actually right back to ancient Greek philosophy, which is whether it's about pleasure and meaning. And the hedonists thought about it as pleasure, and Aristotle and people who talked about eudaimonia thought about it as sort of meaning and virtue. Aristotle had this idea that you can only know if you're happy when you're at the end of your life and you're looking back, which is quite harsh, but in a way, I think it's both in the sense that if we have a life which is meaningful but no fun, then we run out of energy quite quickly. And if it's all fun and pleasure and there's no meaning, then we sort of lose our way. And we kind of need both of those parts, and they work in different time frames. And so there's a nice tension between them and a nice synergy between them. And obviously there are times when you can get to in life which, you feel you've got lots of meaning but no pleasure, and you can get yourself into a crisis about that. I mean, I've been divorced, and I've actually got in a situation where my marriage was hugely meaningful to me, but I really didn't enjoy it. And that created a sort of crack in my life that I had to resolve. And so that I think of it that way as well. So that's sort of two different ways: feeling good and doing well, and pleasure and meaning.
I quite like the whole principle of, it's quite an emotional response as well, isn't it? It's a personal response to what's going on around us, I guess.
Yeah, our feelings are very much about what's going on around us. They're sort of us in our environment. In fact, the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, I don't know if you've ever read him. Have you read him?
I have, yeah.
Have you read his most recent one, A Strange Order of Things?
Maybe give us a snippet from that.
Yeah, it's a funny title of a book, but basically he's talking that feelings and emotions come before cognition, come before central nervous systems in our evolutionary history.
Right.
And that they actually help us do three things, feelings. They help us monitor our environments, they help motivate us to act, and they help us adjust those actions over time. And that first one of monitoring is sort of, our feelings are, actually I often say our feelings are data, that they actually give us information about what's going on around us. And that's not just our feelings become emotions, but, do we feel hot or cold? Do we feel hungry? Do we feel thirsty? It's basically telling us about, and it's motivating us to act in some sort of ways. But, our feeling of feeling frightened is that, there feels like there's a danger out there and that we need to help avoid or get ourselves out of that threat. And we often have the feeling well before we have the cognition. And that's really his argument, is that the feeling comes first and then we apply our intelligence to that feeling and deciding how we're going to act.
And the cognition, of course, prevents us from doing crazy things, which is why the executive part of our brain slows down and stops in some cases, while we'll deal with those emotional reactions, of course.
Yeah, I'm not a total expert on the absolute specifics in it, but they absolutely are interconnected. And actually, even if you think about something positive like happiness, which is a little bit of a sort of gateway word to a whole range of positive emotions, in that we can use the word very broadly, but then actually you get to specifics. Some people will say, if I say, what's happiness mean to you, they'll say contentment, and other people will say joy. Well, contentment and joy are quite different. Yeah. One's very high energy and one's quite low energy. And of course, there's actually a whole range of things in there, like, joy and enjoyment are different, and amusement and, and things like enjoyment, amusement, laughter are sort of very social, and they're very about bonding with other people. So when you're having a laugh with people or mucking around, you actually slow down, you shut down your executive decision making and your full intelligence, because you're trying to bond. It doesn't pay you to be your brightest, most sort of challenging self at that moment. You're better to conform. So actually there are times when we're happy when we're probably less intelligent, but there are other times, if we think about other forms of happiness, such as curiosity or interest, which are very engaging parts of that sort of positive emotions, when we're absolutely fully using our intelligence. And I think it's sometimes why in business and organizations people get worried about happiness. They kind of think people will be happy clappy and not very bright. Well, there's certain forms of it which that's true for, so they can point to it. But actually what they really want is people to feel positive and safe, enthusiastic, and sometimes to have a laugh, but just maybe 5-10% of the time, and other times be doing other bits. So there's really this whole myriad of different positive emotions, and we want to be agile and moving around between them.
Sure. Now, society also plays a massive part in this, doesn't it? So over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, if you think about societies describe happiness with good economies, wealth, good social well-being and obedience. Having researched this all over the planet, what's your take on how that plays out?
Well, it's for certain that nations have different levels of average happiness, and actually different distributions of happiness in them. And some of that, both the averages and the distribution, can be explained by economic and societal factors. And then there's stuff more below that. But, if we look at rank orders of nations on happiness, then Scandinavian countries tend to come top. And that's a lot to do with their social safety nets, which is, it's not really to do with the fact that the sort of, I was going to say the average, but by the average, I mean the median, the person in the middle, is not particularly happier in Scandinavia than, say, in the UK or the US. But where they do much, much better is that the bottom half of the distribution, or the lowest 25% in terms of income, are much less unhappy in Scandinavia than they are in the UK, the US, and places like that. So it's more that they don't have the tail of the distribution pulling the mean down. They have more equal distribution of happiness within it, and that's kind of interesting. If because people often go, oh well, say the Swedes are happier, but don't they have high suicide rates? Don't they have this? And I don't find the Finns very extrovert, and that's probably all true. I mean, but there are other factors also, which is if you live in a broadly happy society and you're unhappy, you probably take it more personally, and so actually countries with a higher happiness rate may possibly have a higher suicide rate, whereas if you live in a country such as India or Pakistan or somewhere where there's much lower levels, suicide rates are probably lower because people feel more normalized about their unhappiness.
Less highs and lows. Is that how I'm reading it?
Yeah, sort of. You feel less personally. If you everyone around you is happy and you're miserable, you feel it's very much your fault, and so therefore, I'm a burden on other people, and you get into this very difficult logic where you start thinking it's actually better for you to take your own life, which is tragically how some people get. Whereas if everybody is, you just feel like, well, it's happening to all of us, which in the current situation with the anxiety around lockdown and COVID, because everybody feels in the same boat, we're feeling more open about our anxiety because we kind of know it's not about us feeling bad, it's about the environment, so it makes it easier to talk about.
You also spent a significant amount of time pulling together enormous research to create the Happy Planet Index. Just tell the listeners a little bit about what the Happy Planet Index is.
Yeah, the Happy Planet Index is sort of a proposed alternative to GDP as a way of measuring the progress of nations. And I've always felt that GDP was a really bad measure of welfare, of the well-being of a nation. In fact, one of my first published bits of work is from 94, and it was an alternative to GDP. But it was very complicated. It was very objective. It was basically a huge cost-benefit analysis of the economy and had a lot of assumptions in it. And I knew it was very complicated, but when I used to go and do talks about it, rightly or wrongly, what it did show was that about the mid-70s was about the highest in this index, and it trading off. And people go to me, that's how it feels to me, particularly older people would go. And
right.
I always thought, that's interesting. It doesn't say anything about what you feel. It's just a whole load of economic data put together. And that started me perhaps thinking about how you measure what you feel. But when it came to the Happy Planet Index, which was released in 2006, so like 12 years after that first bit of work, I wanted to do something very simple and easier to agree with. I sort of learned that complexity in indicators tends to put people off, or if they get interested, they then start looking at all the assumptions and the debate gets about the detail, not the bigger picture. And so what I did with the HPI was I said, well, what's the outcome you really want from a country? And I said, it's to produce good lives that don't cost the earth. And the planet bit in there is the sustainability element of it. And so I went, well, you could measure good lives by looking at the data on happiness across nations, so the quality of people's lives. You can then adjust that for the length of their lives, so life expectancy, which is a very good, reliable piece of health statistics you've got data on from around the world. But you've also got to think about the efficiency as a nation, like how much resources does it use to get there? So the Happy Planet Index became a environmental efficiency of delivering well-being, a sort of bang for your buck indicator. And that's what it did. It ranked ordered nations across the world, and basically you have some countries which have got high well-being but high environmental impact, and that would be typically Western rich countries. You've got countries which have got low well-being but low environmental impact, so those are Sub-Saharan Africa and other nations which are really struggling. And then you've got countries which are interesting, which have got pretty good levels of well-being and much lower resource use, and typically they were Central Latin American or some of the islands of the world, or some of the Asian countries which were which were doing well. And that became interesting to think, okay, how can we create a sustainable future which is also a good future? Because the problem with the environmental movement, which I certainly have been a part of and absolutely bought into, but I think they sell very negative visions of the future with the idea that you can scare people into changing their behavior. And I think we can all see over the last 25 years that hasn't worked. So, how do we do it in a way which we actually say to people, well, actually, this could be a better future? And in some ways, some of that is going on right now with COVID, in that people are thinking about, well, I'm staying at home, I'm traveling much less. It's actually less stressful for me. And it's about identifying those positives. As we come out of COVID, it would be a shame if we don't take some benefits in reducing, carbon emissions and other things. I mean, that'd be disappointing having had this forced on us to not get some positives out of it. Although no one welcomes COVID, we could still get some positives out of it.
Almost the planet's opportunity to start giving back, isn't it, at this time?
Yeah, I mean, there are people that go all that way and say it's, Gaia's feedback, and I don't go quite to that level, but it's an opportunity, isn't it? I think like any setback is an opportunity to learn, even if you didn't want to get into it.
We're going to start to talk a little bit about what you're doing at the moment with Friday Pulse, but just before we do, what is the happiest place statistically on Earth?
Well, last year's data showed Finland as the happiest nation. And then the only within country data that I know very well is the UK. And if you were in the regions of the UK, and I think it always surprises people, but actually London is the least happy region because it's urban, because inequalities are high there, things like that, and people are very close together. Whereas the happiest region of the UK is Northern Ireland, which is much more rural, and of course recent memories of troubles, so they've actually got a sort of point to go back to. So there's sort of different things, but at the national level, it's Finland at the moment, but it has been Norway previously, and Sweden and Switzerland, and Denmark have done well. Costa Rica is the very surprising one that comes through that's particularly happy compared to its GDP. So yeah, that's the way it sort of is.
Cool. And what would be the kind of one or two things that are consistent across those higher ranking, happier places?
So there's income distribution, which is that they basically tend to be more equal countries, which is what Scandinavia is. And actually, even Costa Rica is more equal than its sort of neighbors around it, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and all those other places around there. So it does very well in that. And there's also high levels of literacy, gender equality in Costa Rica, which, of course, are things that Scandinavia is particularly good at. So equality tends to come out stronger than people think. But of course, richer countries are happier. That's sort of undeniable. They're just not becoming any happier with the extra amounts of wealth we have. We're not seeing those countries on a trajectory to become happier. The countries that are on a trajectory to become happier are some of the developing countries, because they're reducing, poverty. They're reducing, early deaths. So, that obviously is a positive.
And I wonder, is it more visible to them at the same time?
Yes, it probably is. I mean, there are differences between them. Like South Korea has been studied quite a lot because they've obviously been one of the Asian tigers, and their happiness levels have gone up, but they're very, very materialistic there, and they haven't gone up as much as, say, a country like Vietnam or something like that, who are slightly less so. So there are interesting differences between them, and some of them are to do with density of population as well. But there's not just sort of one straight pathway. There are differences.
Makes lots of sense. Thank you very much, Nic. So the organisation you lead now, Friday Pulse, seeks to take that distillation of happiness data, but from the colleagues and customers at the organisations that you work with, to create something that leadership and other colleagues can actually use as a lens to get a sense check of how their workforce feels, how happy they are almost. Tell us a little bit about how Friday Pulse was created.
Yes, I did my TED talk on the Happy Planet Index and other work I'd done in 2010, and obviously that's quite an honour. And I sort of came out of it thinking it sort of allowed an opportunity to sort of bookend that part of my work. I mean, I'd accidentally got into policy, and I'd done it for 10, 12 years then. And when you're working on something like climate change, it's quite slow moving. And, I thought, well, I've got something else in me, maybe do something. And I was always interested in business. My dad was a businessman. He led an organization. And I thought, well, this is very applicable there. If leaders knew how happy or not teams were, that would give them useful information. So I started creating a happiness at work survey, which was a one-off survey to begin with, and learned a lot about how the data worked in organizations, started to get my own opinion about what I thought the drivers of happiness at work were and how we could measure them. But I actually hadn't created a tool that was exceptionally responsive. It's like a one-off survey, like most other surveys are. But started to think, well, actually, what really an organization needs to know is know how it's moving through time. And so started thinking there's a way of measurement and happiness we call, well, there's three ways of measuring in happiness, really, which is that we can do what's called a cognitive assessment, which is what most surveys are, which is we ask people to look overall and reflect on it. You can do something which is called experience sampling, where you basically bleep people during the day or text them or whatever, say, how do you feel right now? It gives really nice data, but it's really annoying. So the one in between is called episodal measurement, and you get to the end of an episode and you ask people to reflect back on it. And I decided to go for that way of measuring it and started off asking people various cadences. So a month, how's your last month been? A day, how's your day been? And settled on a week, because daily was a little bit too annoying, and also you could only just ask people how happy were you or not, and nothing more. If you asked them monthly, it wasn't very responsive. So much can happen in a month, as we've learned recently. And weekly is the sort of sprint of work we tend to work to. So we ask people on a Friday, that's why we call Friday Pulse, how was your week? How did you feel this week? And that creates a very responsive, we call it happiness KPI, but a very responsive metric, which when you group it at a team level is effectively a measure of team morale. When you group it at an organizational level, it's people's experience of the culture of the organization, experience of work right now. And so you can look at that. And I mean, the good thing about a question like that is you can ask, a truck driver that question, you can ask a CEO that question, and they can give you an answer to it. Whereas if you ask people how engaged were you this week, most people don't even know how to answer that question. They don't have an idea of what the top of the scale is particularly. They know if they're disengaged, they don't really know where the top of the scale is. So when you ask people how you felt and were you happy or not, they can give you an answer that's very good, reliable data in that way.
And what do you notice the themes are that contribute to a happy culture at work for leaders listening to this podcast?
There are some general themes across an organization, and there are ways that you can articulate. So the way that we do is we say there are 5 ways to happiness at work, and they are connect, which is relationships are the most important. They're kind of the cornerstone of creating good experiences or undermining experience for that case, for that matter. The second one is to be fair, which is that if people feel they're treated fairly, respectfully, then they can bring themselves to work much more. The third is to empower them, sort of their autonomy, delegating, get them to use their strengths. The fourth is to challenge them. So this is sort of misunderstanding of happiness, that people are happy doing nothing. It's actually not true. They're bored. And actually people like it when there's a bit of stretch. Not if you stretch them too much, challenge them too much, they go into stress. If you under challenge them, they go into apathy and boredom. You've got to get the right sweet spot, which is always tends to be the way anyway. And then the fifth one is to inspire, which is about meaning, purpose, where they feel they're doing it's worthwhile. So those 5 things, connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire, are the big drivers. But then there's specific things that go on, which is really to do with the environment and what's going on around them very locally, which is that some teams will find them in a very stressful situation, or their work environments are stressful. So with people moving remote at the moment and very quickly moved remote a few weeks ago, that some people were happier working at home than others, and a lot to do with their environments, whether they got children, whether they, had the right equipment at home, whether they had a quiet space, whatever it was. So some of those things are very, very local, and some of those bigger, broader cultural things. So yeah, there's those 2 effects really.
And like any business and any part of any business, it's feedback data that I'm getting. And also aligned to that is that leadership choice as to what I do with that information as I receive it, right?
Totally. And in fact, the whole of Friday Pulse is really a feedback loop. And actually, it's very similar to therapy in some ways, which is that in therapy, therapist listens to their client and they reflect back to them, and then they work with them about the challenges that they're facing. And we listen to the population, the employees, by asking them every Friday, how do they feel? We feed that back to them and the team leaders, and then senior leaders, you stack the data up in nice reporting. And that enables people to then work together to make better experiences. So one of the things I'm very keen on is people don't just focus on the negatives, don't just focus on the deficits. They actually appreciate the assets and the positives going on. And so on a Friday, we don't only ask people how they felt. We also ask them, what was the success for you this week? Have you got anyone you want to thank? Because appreciating each other is really important for both sides of that equation. And then we give people the opportunity to share frustration or an idea to make things better. But actually, most of our clients really, really work on accentuating the positive, because in lots of ways, businesses tend to focus on how do you solve problems, what comes up, and actually probably often don't take the time to go, yes, good job, and to actually get that human appreciation, which actually we all really respond well to.
And hitting back to the neuroscience we talked on a little bit earlier, of course, it will release different neurotransmitters that create that self-fulfilling prophecy of getting additional positive outcomes from our thinking and our behaviors, which helps improve happiness, of course.
It certainly does. And I mean, all of this works together, physically, but I always think about it as like, if someone compliments you, your sort of head goes up and your shoulders go back and you sort of feel bigger because you're feeling confident. Whereas when someone criticizes you, you can tend to sort of hunch up and pull your shell in, and protect yourself. And we're much better when we're expansive and shoulders back, and actually other people like working with us more like that as well. So there's so much to be gained from being positive. But of course, you have to be realistic. It doesn't mean to say you let people travel out into a sort of fantasy world where everyone's doing a good job. No, the point is, really differentiating and really understanding and helping people build on their positives.
So this part of the show, we're going to turn away from you being a statistician, but look at you through your leadership lens, running an organisation. And at this part of the show, we like to ask our guests to share their top leadership hacks or ideas. So if you could share, based on your experience as a leader, your top leadership hacks, what would they be, Nic?
I think that the big thing is listening to people. I don't employ people to tell them what to do. I employ people to work with them and get the best out of them, and actually learning to bring the best out of them. The main way is listening to them, even when they disagree with you. So I think listening is probably the first one. Second one is, I think, little and often. I think I've tried to, where I've gone wrong previously would be when I've tried to do big interventions, and actually I think doing smaller ones, checking, is a much better way. But consistently, I definitely have had to learn that, leadership is a weekly process, maybe even a daily process, but a weekly one, where you're asking questions every week and you're listening every week, rather than just sort of going, right, these are our goals for the next quarter, and then checking in 2-3 months later and realizing people have gone down a different tangent, or something's emerged, maybe for good reasons, but you don't know about them. So I think the little and often is probably the next one. For me, definitely, I think inspiring people, which is that I hold the vision for the company. I don't necessarily hold all the solutions, but I hold the vision for where we're going and why we're doing it, and remembering to remind people about that. So reminding them of the why, but it's actually, bringing that into your weekly work. In that, particularly with all the adjustments we've made just recently in COVID, everyone going remote, I've sort of had to remind myself to remind everybody why we're doing this, if that makes sense.
It makes loads of sense. It's one of those things that you set off a vision to start with, and other things get in the way. And we as leaders also need reminding that it's our job to remind people and to make sure that we're continually talking about the journey and how we're going to get there and what's going to get in the way and remove barriers. It's part and parcel of that, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's actually a bit of the job I really like. Some of the detailed bits I'm less good at. It's funny, I'm very good at details and stats, but I can sometimes sort of like, I probably, like many people, not got the longest attention span, and I sometimes sort of start, and I have to make myself up for it. But the inspiring bit and the listening to how they feel and what they're doing, I can do that for ages because I really like people, and I really believe in what we're doing. So those are the bits I find easier. It's keeping people on track, and the detail that is always my learning edge.
Thanks for being so honest, and they're great hacks also. So when we start to think at this part of the show, we've really enjoyed getting into the heads of our leaders and our guests where they've maybe screwed up in the past or something's gone catastrophically wrong, and indeed they are now using that experience as a positive in their life. We call this hack to attack. What would yours be?
Hack to attack. Well, I mean, in some ways, I've sort of pointed to it with a little bit of those last bits, but I think that I have definitely been guilty of letting things run for too long. Because I wasn't confident enough to challenge people, and so I previously had someone in the business, and she has some really strong qualities, but it just sort of always going pear-shaped, and I kept on coming back to every 3 or 4 months, but really we should have parted companies at least a year before we eventually did, and that cost us a lot. She wasn't happy. She wasn't doing quite what she wanted to do. I was trying to, I guess, force her, or there was a role that needed doing, and I was wanting her to do that role. And she wasn't quite wanting to do it, and she was definitely capable of it, but it just sort of ran on far too long, and in the end it all became very messy and angry. And I think if I'd dealt with it much earlier, we'd have had a lot less problems. And it's the same problem I had with my marriage, actually, which was that I let things run too long, and I should have been challenging and about that earlier. And so I think that's my weakness, is tending to gloss over some of the negatives. My positivity overrides listening to negative feedback or negative signals. And I think that's actually a really important leadership, is to be able to, one, hear the negative signal, and two, deal with it, because it doesn't go away.
It's great learning, Nic. And also, if you think about the themes that you are now encouraging other leaders to talk about through Friday Pulse, there's a lot of synergies there in terms of what your learned behaviours are to what you're encouraging others to learn from now. So that's super stuff. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about, and this is where we're going to ask you to do some time travel. I want you to think about, if you were able to bump into Nic at 21, you're able to give him one bit of advice that would make the difference, what would it be?
I quite like my life, even my mistakes. So, that's not like something I'd massively want to change. I mean, I think I was a little uptight as a 21-year-old. I was a little serious, and I had the future weighed on me quite a lot. I sort of kind of had this feeling I wanted to do something, and I probably wanted to do it quicker than was possible. And I have actually done things which are interesting. I think I just would say, relax, it will be okay. Follow what you're interested in. I mean, in some ways I have done that, actually. So, but when I was 21, I was a little bit still uptight. Yeah.
If only Nic would know, the 21-year-old Nic, who might have been a little bit uptight, still found his way to be where you are now, which is, impacting the lives of many other people. So that's great advice.
Yeah, it's nice to think that the 21-year-old Nic would be horrified at the thought that the 55-year-old Nic had got divorced. He wouldn't like that at all. But apart from that, he'd probably take the rest.
Good stuff. Okay, so as people have been listening to you, Nic, we will make sure that we encourage them to get over to TED and have a look at the Happy Planet Index talk, which I think is really inspiring, and I love that. But where else can they find out about the work that you do with Friday Pulse, and indeed some of the things that you do now?
Yeah, so Friday Pulse is the name of the company, so it's fridaypulse.com, and it's actually, we're offering it free for organizations up to 1,000 people at the moment, so they can try it for 3 months and see how they go with it, and see how they like the data and how they can work with it. I create blog articles and posts on LinkedIn most weeks, so you connect with me on LinkedIn. I always like meeting new people there. And I have a personal website, which is more my sort of speaking musing, which is nicmarks.org. Nic is no K in that. So those are the main ways to find me.
We'll make sure they're in the show notes to accompany this podcast as well, Nic. So as people have finished listening, they can literally just click into those links and hop over to find you.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Nic, I just wanted to say I'm incredibly happy that you've chosen to be with the Leadership Hacker podcast. I've spoken to you a few times now, and I've loved the conversations that we've had. And as a result, I know we're going to get a lot of happy hackers listening to you too. So thanks for being on the Leadership Hacker podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I genuinely want to say a heartfelt thanks for taking time out of your day to listen in too. We do this in the service of helping others and spreading the word of leadership. Without you listening in, there would be no show. So please subscribe now if you haven't done so already. Share this podcast with your communities and network, and help us develop a community and a tribe of leadership hackers. And finally, if you'd like me to work with your senior team, your leadership community, keynote an event, or you would like to sponsor an episode, please connect with us via our social media. And you can do that by following and liking our pages on Twitter and Facebook. Our handle there is @LeadershipHacker. Instagram, you can find us there at @the_leadership_hacker. And at YouTube, we're just Leadership Hacker. So that's me signing off. I'm Steve Rush, and I've been the Leadership Hacker.